Wohoro Ndohho, CEO of Sandbox Capital and a former boss at the Public Debt Management Office, the National Treasury. Welcome back.
Asante sana. Yes.
Let's start with the proverb. Where have you been hiding? Did you think that they don't have eyes?
The bush couldn't see you.
I was busy just existing, quite apart from trying my hand at government and things.
Things went
various
as they went.
things.
Now, by the way, give us that experience. We've been talking about it here. So, 9,000 or so of you applied
Yes,
to be principal secretaries.
Right.
And then some 500 or so of you were shortlisted. You were among them. You went for an interview. It was about a 30-minute interview.
Correct.
So just take us through that. You work in, you sit down. How many people are interviewing you? What kind of questions are they asking in 30 minutes? How many panelists? How many members of the interviewing panel?
It was amazing. There's quite a number of us. So we were about three. There are three panel members. And they pick a random question, and just to see whether you have a good sense of government and you knew a way around the structure of government. And then there's always the trick question, which if you've never been in government, it's going to be a bit discombobulating, as it were.
I'd like to know that question, that when you're asked,
Yes,
it will be clear you have nothing, you know nothing about government.
Sina maoni.
Kuna maoni.
There's a sina maoni moment.
Sina maoni answer.
Sina maoni. You just sit there. But to be honest, I think these things tend to be quite clear. I mean, every regime that comes in has a pretty clear idea of the team they want. So, one could take the cynical view that it's predetermined. But at the same time, it's good to go through the process because you get to engage with the public service. One thing that's really strikes me about Kenya, I'm reminded every time with government, is we have talent pouring out of our ears. We have too much. We don't know what to do with it. And so even the earlier conversation you had here with your last guests, it's a tragedy, really, that with all that talent, we are in such a pickle. Yeah, so that's what happens and it's fairly straightforward. You don't really. It's not as so cloak and dagger as you think. It's an interview after a fashion, but always you go with a view that you don't know if you're among the few chosen ones, but put your hat in the ring, see what happens, and then live to fight another day.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So that particular bush, when you entered it, did you know it had eyes?
Have you noticed the man has avoided that question?
Completely.
That leakage.
No, he understands it has eyes. Yes. And yes. And now, so do we.
That proverb actually reminds me of this thing.
Mobile phone.
Mobile phone. Yeah. You can run, but you can't hide. It's been amazing to see. If you've noticed, a lot of crime is solved very quickly these days. And some of us have not quite caught on why our security services are very, very efficient at solving crime. I think it's, to your proverb, I think this is a modern version of it.
Whatever you hide.
Even the bush has eyes, yes.
Yes, the bush has eyes.
That's right.
So we have, even the last time you were here, we were talking about what are the opportunities that people need to take advantage of into the new regime as you're going forward, looking at the next 5 years.
Right.
At that point, you were seeing, all right, so the new administration is coming on. One of the big campaign promises was supporting SMEs to grow.
Yeah.
You deal with SMEs on a daily basis. Now there's a Hustler Fund. They say the Hustler Fund for the SMEs will be launched in February. There's a Hustler Fund for everybody, cash transfer program that's available now. Nilichukua jana nikakula lunch, by the way. Naona kama nitalipa next week. Idea. I was in a bit of a pickle.
All right.
I just going there and get money and pay. How is it that people who are actually running business and they'd like to see their ideas grow, how is it that from what you're hearing from government, how are they positioning to support these businesses?
Okay, just maybe as I'm answering that question, one of the things that really has struck me about this whole Hustler Fund, and it's true that the bigger rollout is yet to happen, is that ultimately it's not really rocket science. I mean, I think we all know the answers to what the fundamentals are, and it's been, I think, repeated ad nauseum, but I'll repeat it anyway for the benefit of those of us who might have forgotten. As long as the government is in the borrowing game, it's going to be very difficult for everyone else. And the likes of the Hustler Fund and many other funds, because this is not the first fund. We've had the Youth Fund, we've had the Wohoro. Again, I'm preaching to the choir. But, governments can only be best when sometimes they're actually out of the picture altogether. And so the Hustler Fund in many ways will be more of a catalyst. But if you're looking for fundamental change, we're all going to have to rewind back to, I know I've said this for the umpteenth time, to Kibaki. So he just got government out of borrowing, and the next thing you knew, we couldn't beat these banks off with a stick because they were all over lending. The size of the problem is so huge that a government is a derivative of the private sector. In other words, the government is financed out of the private sector. And so by definition, a government is smaller than the private sector because it derives its income from the private sector. So if by the same token, the government gets out of places where it impedes the private sector, the size of the private sector is that it multiplies its effect much more effectively. For example, if let's imagine 60 billion when the government borrows 60 billion tomorrow. That 60 billion is taken out of circulation, right? Now it's brought back in through whatever project the government is doing, but that 60 billion cannot be lent to the private sector. And so I take a view with Hustler Fund and many others. They're critical, they're useful as catalysts, but as long as I see government borrowing, that I think creates a challenge for the sustainability of it. Because in any event, even that 50 billion that's being lent to us is really private sector money. It came in through taxes, it's going out through. But that 60 billion, when the machinery of government takes out 2 trillion. So that gives you some idea of scope. And so in this instance, I think it's going to be a good first step, but it must be used, I would think it should be used a little more differently, more as a catalyst than as a direct lending.
And the difference is what?
Exactly.
What's a catalyst in direct lending?
Okay. What I mean is that there's a reason why banks don't lend to SMEs, right? A lot of them have to do with credit not being credit worthy. So when you use like the Hustler Fund to say, look, you guys as the banks, because we put 50 billion aside, but that underwrites the risk that normally you will not give Wohoro if Wohoro walked in. So when Wohoro walks in and he's got a cover from the Hustler Fund, but Wohoro doesn't want 20,000, he wants 100,000. We can say at least it's covered for the first 20,000. But that 20,000 has given Wohoro a capacity now to access 100,000. So basically what you do is by giving that sort of guarantee, you catalyze people's borrowing, because now more people can go to banks, but banks are also more willing to lend because they can see you're backed up by somebody who's heavy. By somebody else. So the 50 billion can actually be multiplied 3, 4, 5 times. But when you give it as cash out, then it stops there. Because like you said, if today you have a cash flow and it's accessible, there's no way of knowing that it's going to be used in business. But if you go for a business loan, you go through a process that ensures you use the money for
the business.
For what you borrowed it for, yeah.
You're talking about the credit guarantee. There's already a program such as that. It was launched by the president last year or 2020. A credit guarantee scheme with various banks whose uptake was completely a flop, so to speak. What's happening with that?
See, the Hustler Fund, I think what makes it interesting is the ease of access, because government is actually doing the lending. But I think the lesson learned from that...
And there are no questions being asked.
And that's the risk of
That's important.
that's the risk of it. To me, I think that's part of the reason why I fear that might not quite achieve what it was. To be honest, I think my other view as an economist is the Hustler Fund is an extremely smart way of broadening the tax net.
Oh, it's just bringing everybody on board.
It will, absolutely. And you've been told, we've got 30 million of us on Safaricom, and only 7 million are paying taxes. I can tell you for free, by the time all of us have borrowed from the Hustler Fund, we'll all be on the tax debt. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, it then it creates some interesting questions around other uses of that process. So
why did the credit guarantee scheme not work as it was envisioned to work? And how different would the SME Hustler Fund product?
Yeah, I think its issue was it depended on the self-same financial sector system that has denied us money anyway as SMEs.
Yep.
So you still had to take people through the banks. And then you had what you call a moral hazard, in that the banks that would normally lend you were also, it was a fox. It was also the one in charge of the chicken coop. And so when you came in from outside, wanted to borrow, the bank said, well, it's not in really my interest to make this thing succeed, right? And so you're put through exactly the same hassles as everyone else. So it was not enough that the government stood behind it. So the issue of access even to that guarantee made it almost discouraged. I think it discouraged a lot of SMEs from even applying. And I think from afar, people, and of course, private sector is very, very sensitive to nuance. The moment it saw that this thing was going to be within the same framework of
still have
the
to
bank,
walk into the bank, and the bank will still subject me through the same questions, rigorous questions.
So you see, in fact, the government did exactly the same thing, but now did like how the Hustler Fund works, and said, no, you come to us, and then through the Hustler Fund, back to back. So the bank, the government is on this side, the banks on this side, the Hustler Fund is in the middle, and the government is saying to the banks, we are watching this. Don't make this thing difficult. That could probably work better.
Are SMEs still considered if we're going to look at private sector, quote unquote private sector, whatever that would encompass, the driving force for the economy? And if that is the thinking, will it, the way in which it is currently set up, then be able to fuel this directly? If we're saying finally the Messiah has come and the one man that can put the economy back together, like Humpty Dumpty, is it SMEs then that would be able to do that? And is that the thinking of government right now? From your past experience, because it continues to be that SMEs will be the ones that will spur economic activity, and we glorify it using this acronym. But SME is anybody really?
True.
Who has one person under their employ, 3, 4, 10, 100 people, are they the ones that will then mushroom this economic activity and then grow the economy?
The short answer is yes. What is well understood is the fact that the private, what you're calling the SMEs is really the private sector. The big boys are very few. In fact, I'd say when you talk about the private sector, the big end of town is a minority. It's very small. But it's an extremely useful, small, because it aggregates wealth. So they're easy for taxation, they're easy for following up. But the average Kenyan out there lives in small businesses. And so this whole process was, how do you then get that the smaller Kenyan to be able to thrive and grow? But if you can't do that, if at the same time you're also borrowing from the same market that you're telling these Kenyans to go, which is part of the reason I say that until we get to a place where the government does actually get out of borrowing domestically, most of these other programs will be fairly peripheral, because they will not go to the core issue of making credit available. Those of us who remember, it was a golden season of about 4 or 5 years. And then, in fact, a good number of the wealth Yeah, actually, before the Wohoro regime came in, a good part of the growth in the wealth in the economy was precisely because the government just refused to borrow domestically.
So my cash was available.
Cash was available, and the banks did not have an alternative place to grow their profits.
So they actually went to the traditional way of doing business.
Yeah.
Meaning buying and selling money to individuals. Yes.
But SMEs Wohoro require more than that, more than just getting into a bank and coming out with money.
True. And then that's the second part of it. And see, when we were talking about how do you turbocharge the economy, the whole notion, like I've said this before, we talked about the Small Business Administration in the US and how it just doesn't look at loans alone. In fact, if anything, it looks at the capacitation of business enterprises. But more importantly, because it was a government agency, it also took on a bit of what you'd call the Kenya Investment Authority role, but now for businesses. So that, for example, you're setting up a business, they should have a way by which you can go to for skills development, training, what have you. You can also get financing, if you're not financing the salary, but the government backing you to go and get financing. That whole other aspect of supporting SMEs is something that I think we don't hear as much, but it's particularly critical. And it should be quite easy now with our digital platforms. Yeah.
Which then, if you think about the structure of government, so there's a ministry and a State Department for SMEs. And then on this other side, there's a ministry and a State Department for industry. All right? Now, those two are working separately.
That is
does that raise an issue? Because, I mean, if you're thinking about how to industrialize this country using the small and micro enterprises, this, like, the government looks at them as two different entities.
And that's actually a very perceptive observation. And that it needs to be integrated. Separating the two, I think, is a false dichotomy because they live in the same space. And in fact, one of the things that I've been thinking about around turbocharging economy is the whole notion of how do you move SMEs into industrialization. The day we do that, then we talk a very different language. Something I've been thinking about, for example, is, and I've said this, every civilization, a civilization is not a civilization if it can't do three things: feed itself, finance itself, and protect itself. That's an industrial base.
Yeah.
And in each of those three, SMEs should be the vanguard, should be the foot soldiers of those movements. So like in the feeding yourself, you talk about agriculture, I think is enough process happening there. In financing, another big one. And here I think is where another huge opportunity is. What is the SME version of the finance sector? What would that look like? We have an inkling of it a bit because we have this M-Pesa agents and what have you.
Yeah.
They're in a sense micro SMEs in the finance space.
In the finance space.
But they are,
or like the bank agents.
Or bank agents. But see, they could be particularly powerful for making access to finance. If you can get past a lot of the regulations and rules that banks have, conservatively placed because the banks can make money more easily elsewhere. So essentially, if tomorrow the government stopped borrowing from the private sector, from the private sector, we've got, I think like 300,000 micro banks or micro finance agents out there. They would all be put to work selling money.
Yep.
And that would be revolutionary. And Kenya is probably one of the few countries that can do that because we already have the infrastructure in place.
The network is in place.
The big one, of course, is manufacturing. And I just want to give you the example of the other day when Gov't Industries started producing mining ore to produce steel locally. That was huge in my mind, huge. Now, if you think of all the value chains that come out of the fact that we're producing all iron and steel here for the first time in our history, can you think of every other value chain all the value chains that grow from that? I'll give an example. Once you buy this steel, you go set up as a family business producing nuts and bolts, right? just nuts and bolts, and nails even say.
Yeah.
That, its biggest cost will be energy, which then links again to another part of the economy. But a lot of economies, especially like Germany, Japan, even the West to a large extent, actually began its industrialization by having family-owned businesses partner with the bigger businesses as suppliers of product, and then the Toyotas of this world will do the assembly and the larger machining parts. But that was really important because it then did two things. One, it spread the production capacity across the economy, across all these SMEs. But also it meant that the fortune of the big boys was very intricately tied to the smaller fellow. But then not only that, the skills that developed at that level were the same skills that, for example, at the time the First World War, even both World Wars, but especially the Second World War, got to a point where so many small business had created this gigantic industrial base called the USA, that tomorrow that civilization could defend itself because it could turn that entire manufacturing capacity to defense. Now, Africa is the only continent that doesn't have that.
Why?
And I think that's the most important question of our times.
We can't stop producing nails to start producing guns. We can't, because we don't even have.
We don't even produce nails.
We are not producing the nails.
And to me, I think when you talk about turbocharging,
again, why?
I'll come to that in a minute. But to me, the notion around turbocharging our SMEs is saying there should be no such thing as a dichotomy between heavy industry and SME. There should be no dichotomy between the big banks and the small banks. Now, of course, the move is towards consolidating banks, and I can see why they would want to do that because of economies of scale. But by the same token, if we are really serious about SMEs, it's saying in every sphere of manufacturing, of production, how do you rejig this structure, this sector, so that small family businesses can start getting involved? Because this would create a whole mind shift. And in fact, maybe there's also an education thing, and that's what TVETs would be very useful. There's shopping centers, you see them everywhere. I've always wondered, if you go to a place like Australia's on, I know, in most town centers like that, they tend to be what they call a machine shop. And the machine shop, what the machine shop does is they've got a lathe and a milling machine. It's just a small engine. This Kalasinga, I think you saw Kalasingas in River Road. And what would happen is, if you are as a farmer, anything breaks, if farming your tractor breaks down and you can't get a spare part, you'd go to the milling machine shop, and they'd fabricate it for you.
Yep.
Now, that was a small family business, but it's really critical to the machinery of, pun intended, to the machinery of manufacturing, because it meant that, for example, if you had a big tractor, this is like in Eldoret, all the surrounding farming communities would have at least, like in Eldoret town, they would have like 10 of those milling shops. And suddenly you change the conversation about spare parts just by having the capacity to produce it locally. And to me, those are the sort of things that say that even our definition of SMEs means moving up the value chain in terms of our skills and the sort of things we do. Because everyone else has done that. In fact, my worry is that the West has gone so far that you've got this thing called CNC, which is machine-led driven milling shops. They've even done away with humans. They've automated everything.
You just go in there and you key in.
That's right.
It gives you the thing that you need.
Right.
Let's take a break.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Siti, as we were taking the break, Wohoro was talking about those cottage industries in the towns and how then they can be used. And you asked, so why don't we have them anyway?
I asked the question because the example is given of the UK, Germany, of the US, and people forget Italy.
That's true.
That the Industrial Revolution was actually based on cottage industries. That's just a simple fact.
Leather.
Yes.
Like that.
You just name it. Okay? Those are what we refer to in modern terminology as SMEs. Okay, and they worked.
Juakali.
Yes, and Juakali. So we already have the raw material for it, the ingredients we have. So the why question was, okay, so this thing that is stopping this evolution that already exists in the country and that has been there for the longest time and that has acted as a backbone to very many things in this economy, why has it not moved to the next level?
And that is a question. Because to me, the notion of moving to the next level is, I give you the example of a machining shop, right? There is no reason on God's good earth right now where every single aggregation of Juakalis should be now an aggregation of machine shops.
Yes.
Right? If you go to Gikomba, that whole place should have like 30 or 40 machine shops producing everything from not carburetors, spark plugs to crankshafts. There's nothing. And now you can produce steel locally. And to me, turbocharging is actually how do you move up the value chain, whichever business you are. So not even necessarily by sector. It's whatever industry you are in. How do you move up the value chain? And it has to be protectionist to some level. And this is one of the conversations that are very unpopular. Every country that has industrialized has been protectionist. For some reason, we in Africa have this funny notion that we have to be completely liberal. No, you first grow your wealth, you shut the door to some extent, you grow your capacity, and then you open, then you can compete. And so when China comes and floods us with its stuff, it's not because we are being liberal. And of course, it's much easier to make money like that by just arbitraging the cost structures of the two countries. But it is not sustainable, right? So your contingent as the city is exactly that. The ability to move up the value chain in terms of the quality of the product you do, but also upgrading the human resource, right? And this is a second part to the question about turbocharging SMEs. Is a lot of our SMEs are sort of stuck, right? You just get to a place where you find someone has been in the same business for 20 years. They know it, but almost 90% of our SMEs are just traders. Buy and sell. Buy and sell. That's only sustainable if where your supply is coming from is working. COVID showed us that supply can stop. So why don't we stop being a consumer? Why don't we also become a producer economy?
So you're saying, that this is the thing. And if you look at the economies that thrived on the same and still continue, because we're talking about generational wealth then that was built for the country as well as individuals who started these businesses. So the real only way out of this thing is to make your own.
Make your own first. Even if it's expensive, make your own first. Master the technology, master the skills. Once you've done that, you can then scale. And once you scale, then your prices come down.
So what stops then these nations that we talk about from doing that? Why? And even, look, when we're talking about getting yourself out of a difficult situation whereby, let's say, the end of World War II that you gave reference to, end of World War II, everything was in a shambles and then started to look at the Marshall Plan and then getting people out of it. But people did not take this Marshall Plan support and put it in their pocket. They took the Marshall Plan support and started to rebuild their economies and started to manufacture again and started to do things. Even when you look at countries like Ireland that went into the severe famine, they started to grow their own food first of all. They stocked their barns and then they took the surplus and then started to sell to other countries.
Right.
Why then is it so difficult for us to see these glaring examples from other parts of the world and then not copy that? We seem to be able to copy other things really, really well.
But the ones that
the ones that can actually do something. Why?
I don't know. You've talked about state capture. I think you could also talk of leadership capture. And by that I mean foreign interest being able to capture a lot of our leadership on this continent to a place that it is... not necessarily this country, because I think we've tried to push very hard against it. But if you've traveled through this continent, you see that the capture of just a small core at the top completely messes up a nation. But then you have to say there are examples or a few countries that are in a good place to do that. And I say they are there. But so leadership capture is one reason why that doesn't happen. The second is the sustainability of a policy. The notion that whenever you change governments, you shift.
You change
completely.
everything. Yes.
To our credit, I think we've done a good job of trying not to do too radical a shift. I think since Kibaki was a fairly big shift between the Wohoro government.
And Kibaki.
Moi and Kibaki, but this was between Kibaki and Wohoro. There was a fair bit of change there. But by and large, there was a continuity of program. And that's important because to the idea of generational. If you're going to change to this model that is high value adding at a cottage industry level, and in fact, I love that cottage more than SMEs because SMEs has been abused. You get into that space where you're saying, okay, what are the skills that we need to turbocharge our competitive advantage in Kenya? Right? It's hides and skins, but Kenya is in a place, of course, IT. In fact, part of the reason I fear that the whole digital space can be a bit of a red herring for an economy is because it has no barriers to entry. So you could give yourself a false sense of wealth.
Yeah.
But remember that all these digital economies are to leverage and to service foreign companies. The most important thing as a country we need to have
the platforms.
That's right. The most important thing you need to be having is what is the root, what is the foundation, and the foundation has to be own manufacturing. You must be able to produce your own nuts and bolts to a whole engine. Last time I came, I said the day we can produce from soil a full diesel engine is the day I say we are ready to talk about,
becoming a middle income industrialized nation.
A true middle income. Because if you follow, for example, if you follow the Ukraine has been a really amazing study. Ukraine, with all its problems, of course, had a leftover equipment from the Soviet era. So at one point, Ukraine was the biggest producer of tanks. Russia used to produce them in the Ukraine.
Yes.
It produced nuclear. Now, a good amount of that capacity was destroyed even before the war. But even now, it has enough of a residual industrial base to sustain a war. Now, of course, they're being helped a lot by the West. But I look at the fact that they can take some of these old tanks, take them in, refurbish them, local talent, back out into the battlefield. Tells that unless you have that base, you could actually create a false sense of prosperity because you're up here in the digital. And remember that the digital space is an enabling technology, right? The fundamental needs to be there first. And that's, I think, to me, the most critical thing for a country like Kenya to become a true middle income is getting to a place where this mic is actually made here. I mean, it was soil, it was ore 30 days ago. Today is a full mic. That value chain at the cottage level
remains in country.
That fact and the capacity to do it internally is the only thing that, for example, kept South Africa able to fight against the sanctions for those of us who are of that vintage.
But the thing that South Africa benefited from was exactly those sanctions. Because they then became insular.
They were forced to be insular.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then things that they grew out of, they grew and developed into, were as a result of that.
True. Mind you, they had the distinct advantage that it was their cousins in Europe who gave them the technology to start.
Most definitely. But if we talk of the West or even China, and any of these countries that we supposedly get a lot of assistance from as though they are the enemy, they are not. They are not our problem.
We are our problem.
It's our thieving, self-centered leaders who are at the heart of this problem because they are the ones who are amenable to being bribed. They're the ones who are amenable to simply doing the very thing that works against what would be of benefit to the citizenry. They are our problem. Because decisions are made. We have iron ore. We export. United Arab Emirates, we export to Spain, we export mostly to China. And then you'll find we also import iron ore from South Africa. So me, I'm a bit confused.
That's economics for you. That always makes sense.
Yes. Is the iron ore cheaper? Is it the sort of iron ore we need? All these questions arise. But if indeed we have iron ore, what Gov't Industries is doing, why didn't we do it earlier? Because it's not as though they are the ones who invented iron ore. Iron ore has been there for the longest time.
What's interesting for them, in fact, you will notice what the gentleman for Defki, the one appeal he made at the launch.
Just call him Guru.
Guru. The Guru.
He goes by the name Guru.
Guru.
Yeah. The other name
He
is
had only
long.
one request to make for the government. What was it, if you remember? Protectionism. He said, now that we can produce it locally, can we stop importing it? And I thought, brilliant. You need, if you're going to be nationalistic, almost before you can build that base, you need to be able to first protect it so it grows, right? Now, of course, there could be many arguments for and against, but I think there's a sense in which you cannot grow that foundation without some level of protection.
The Juakale industry presents us with a reality that we choose to ignore, and that is skill. Skill that can be upgraded to do exactly what we
That's
want.
right.
Because there is a market for what is produced. They've shown it, and that's why they exist, and that's why they continue to exist.
Right.
Okay, now, that next step, that's why I'm pointing to the leadership. Because at the end of the day, the very things that would make us move the next step, those things have to be driven by government. There's no one else who can drive it.
You see, what government can do, and this, I think this regime is trying to make all the right noises, is to say, okay, we will create the enabling environment, right? But having done that, you cannot do that but also participate in it in a way that is antithetical to that effect.
Yeah.
And so I was saying you need to develop this value at the grassroots, but it's an integrated policy. At the same time you're doing it, you're also stepping out of the finance sector to allow price discovery without government in terms of loans and what have you. And as I say, it's a complex machine. It's only a government that can actually do that.
But I think when it comes to government, just with the example that you're giving of Guru saying, now here I am, I've started, support others like me and then protect us, right, by making it harder to import. They had the same conversation with the production of cement. Remember, the same guy owns a cement producing company. And the issue was the debate around clinker.
Right. Clinker, yeah.
So he is producing clinker locally. Other big companies are also producing clinker locally, but a bigger proportion of the clinker that's used in the cement production in the country is imported. Now, the issue of Guru pushing for, can you protect our local production of clinker? And the others ganging up and saying, no, this man is trying to force us to buy his clinker from him. And then government caught in between.
That's right.
And government starts now serving interest instead of actually serving the greater good.
I think it only makes sense. I think the protectionist argument only makes sense if you have an integrated master plan to create the entire value chain. So you're saying even other participants in that sector are going to be participants in that value chain.
Yes.
Then you say we are protecting an entire value chain. So like you say, in 5 years, let's say someone woke up one day and say, in 5 years' time, you're going to have an engine, a diesel engine made in Kenya. Everything made in Kenya. Now that's a target. Now, so what do you need to make that happen? Everyone who's done that value chain, you'll see where the gaps are, and you'll say, okay, who do we need to bring in, or do we need to encourage from TVETs and what have you, to fill in those gaps? And because you have a full value chain, how do we finance that? Maybe you need to create an industrial bank, right? To just for this value chain. But I think to me that's the level of sophistication of this turbocharging that needs to be done. We see good signs of it. My question is it a value chain end-to-end approach? Because you can't pick all value chains. You have to pick the ones that you have a comparative advantage in. But you must absolutely have a manufacturing capacity that is indigenous, is local, and that if the rest of the world shut down, you can at least build from there. And you've got East Africa now, it's not even just Kenya. And you've got Congo, by the way, honestly.
How did Kenya survive the sanctions that were there in the Moi era? When World Bank did their thing, God knows who did their thing. This so-called sector that we refer to as Juakali, that's when its potential and its reality and its contribution was realized. When institutions that the government had put in place, far-sighted thinking that would actually enable us to get there, said die off. No, let me be precise. Killed off.
City is feeling quite militant this morning.
Hey. And yesterday.
Sessional paper of
City needs a break.
1960 Sessional paper number 10 1965 was a blueprint which, by the way, we still follow. And that's what I think people don't realize, that
We're still following
we've
that.
actually had a theme through our development. We've picked speeds and now we've slowed, but Kenya has had actually a trajectory that's been part of a master plan. And to that, and there's credit to that. Now, of course, others like Singapore took the same roadmap and turbocharged it within a year. And now we are going to borrow from them.
Leadership.
Coming back. Wohoro,
Yes.
thank you always for having your time to come and share your insights with us. Come again soon.
All right. Thanks, man.
Wohoro Ndohho is the CEO of Sandbox Capital. And he's been here with us talking about how we can use the SMEs to turbocharge our economy.